Hey everybody, I'm Michael Light, and this is my podcast, The Babylonian. I'm a layman who is absolutely crazy about the Hebrew Bible and about Second Temple Jewish theology. And on this podcast, I'm exploring all of the Hebrew Bible and how it is all completed in the life, death, and resurrection of my Messiah, Jesus. And I also read and write about theology and about other religions that I'm studying. And you can see my raw thoughts on these topics and more by following me on all of my socials. And you can find my more polished works on my website with a link in my show notes. With that said, let's move right into this episode for the week. When you hear the word hell, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Is it some fiery, underground, subterranean torture chamber? Or is it a reality that has started here and now already? The Bible has a lot to say about hell. And when put up against our contemporary understandings of the word hell, the Bible is radically different. If this is true, if this is so, then what is the real hell? How do we escape this horrible reality? And what does it mean for those who can't escape it? If just about anyone today was to be asked to describe hell with a couple of words, it seems to me that the first words that would come to people's minds would be a fiery subterranean torture chamber with the devil as the lead coach torturing people, or, depending on their religious background or views today, they may say that God is in charge and God is the one torturing people. And there's fire and demons are going around whipping people, all these different contemporary Western conceptions of hell. But none of these actually line up with the Bible. And although a lot of us probably know this total misrepresentation of hell is most likely what first appears in our minds when we hear or are talking about the word or the concept of hell. But if this isn't the biblical conception of hell, then what is the biblical conception of hell? I think you might be surprised. Now, depending on your translation, it might be true that many different words are translated into the word hell. There are 3 popular words that get translated into hell. It seems that recently there's been a shift to only 2, but if you have an older one like the King James Version, the word Sheol will be translated into hell. Sheol is a cosmic geographic place that is actually subterranean, and that all is connected to biblical cosmos, which is a whole different topic and which I hope to explore later on. Then there's also the word Tartarus or Tartaro, used only a couple of times, that refers to hell, or is translated as hell in many of our contemporary English translations. And then finally, the most common of words that's translated into the word hell is Gehenna. This is especially the word that Jesus uses the most when talking about hell. And Gehenna is a Greek transliteration of Gehinnom, the valley of Ben Hinnom, the valley of Hinnom, which, if you check in your Old Testament, is a valley just outside of Jerusalem where many great kings and other Israelites, after the divided kingdom of Israel, during the time of the divided kingdom of Israel, just outside of Jerusalem, where many kings and other Israelites apostatized by putting their sons through the fire, offering their sons as burnt offering sacrifices to the god Molech, and participating in pagan rituals and sex celebrations to their pagan gods. You can find out all about this in Jeremiah 7 talks about it. Other places in Jeremiah. I believe it talks about this in Chronicles, and I think probably some other prophets. But anyways, this is a real historic place that you can technically visit even today. Now, is this literal place, this literal location, what Jesus is referring to when he talks about hell? Well, no, because between the Old and New Testament, there's a total shift. There's this new conception of this post-mortem, post-resurrection place of final judgment. In the intertestamental period, many people had come up with this conception of, after the resurrection, not only a place of paradise, of restored creation, like David had prophesied earlier, you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. It's a place that talks about people going to paradise when they die. But there's also this conception of the valley of Ben Hinnom. They actually refer to this in super popular pseudepigraphal works such as Enoch and a bunch of other apocalyptic literatures. They speak of this. And in fact, if you read the book of Enoch and how it talks about this valley of Ben Hinnom, it starts to talk about it as a literal historical place, and then it transforms and it starts talking about it as a place that's outside of the biblical cosmos. It starts talking about it with terms and references to places that you literally cannot even conceive of. It's not even a real place anymore. Like, it is a real place, but it's something that we can't understand. It's a place so real but unreal that we can't even understand it. That's what hell is. And it's outside of our world. And you start to ask, why is it outside of our world? Well, God created the world. God created the world and he said it was good. When he created everything, at the end of all of his creation, he says that all of creation is very good. And at the beginning of Genesis, in Genesis 1:1, when it gives a summary of his creation, it says that he created the heavens and the earth. And even though people today tend to pit hell versus heaven, it doesn't mention hell. It doesn't mention that God created hell. Because all that God created was good. And so whatever hell is, it has to fall outside of that creation, in a completely and totally different place. Now, going back, if you go back and look at those verses that talk about this valley of Ben Hinnom and the hell that they're mentioning and that they're talking about, this hell later becomes a place where fire continues. There's this garbage that's constantly being burned. It's a literal garbage dump where people burn all of their trash. That's what hell is. And this ancient place of apostasy goes on to become a conception of a post-resurrection place of condemnation. Now, while this gives us a better understanding of what hell is, there's still so many questions like, why is this the place that's used as a reference to hell? What does that mean about hell? What does that mean about hell here and now? And it raises a million questions. Many of which I can't answer, many of which I hope to respond to on some level in this podcast episode. So on this episode, I'm going to look at a couple of different Bible verses where Jesus and Jesus' brother James talk about hell, and what they have to say is extremely insightful into the reality of what hell is. And it's directly in relationship to sin and to how people live their lives now, which, as I said before, I think comes as a great surprise to many people today in the West who think that hell is only someplace subterranean with a bunch of fire in the darkness where a bunch of red-horned, winged creatures are whipping people to death. And I think that is just totally and absolutely wrong. I guess just before getting into that, I'd like to bring up a little bit more about the history of hell. One other interesting fact about the way that the word hell gets translated is that actually when the Greek authors of the New Testament, or the Jewish writers who were writing in Greek, the New Testament, used terms to refer to what already had words in Hebrew that were used in the Hebrew Bible, they used words that were also common to the Greek people. For example, Gehenna is a transliteration of the Hebrew Valley of Ben Hinnom. But then there's also Tartarus. Tartarus was a conception that the Greek people had about people who were thrown into, or the Titans, who were thrown down into the deepest part of Hades to be punished eternally, which was actually outstandingly similar to the Jewish conception of the Watchers from Genesis 6:1, which is a completely different story, which I hope to talk about in a later episode as well, who are thrown down into the deepest parts of Sheol. And Sheol also seems to be referred to with the Greek word Hades, which, if you know anything about Greek mythology, is a word that Greeks would have used to refer to the subterranean chamber where they believe people died post-mortem, but also, well, they didn't believe in a resurrection, but for Jews, that would have been post-mortem pre-resurrection. So that's pretty interesting. And then when all of these terms come over to the English, who are pagan Nordic people and who have their own pagan gods, one of them being the goddess of death, Hell, which is also a place, just like Hades was a place in Greek, and also a god, a pagan god. That's the term that they use to translate into hell. And so hell is a person and a place in that pagan mythology, just like the Greek mythology, and just like the Hebrew authors of the first couple books of the Bible talk about Sheol being alive and personify it, or her, or he, whatever pronouns it uses. So that's a quick history. And something else that's interesting to be brought up to a contemporary Westerner and their conception of hell is the fact that not only is hell talked about as being a place of fire and eternal burning, right? Jesus talks about it as being the lake of fire, and many places that talk about that, but there are also many places that talk about it being black. Well, how could a place that has fire, only continual fire, be pitch black? Well, it seems that those descriptions are metaphorical. It's pretty interesting. But anyways, all of that I wanted to get on the table just before we jump into looking at some Bible verses that talk about what hell really is. So without any further ado, I wanted to just jump right into that. So what is hell? Well, remember that the term hell, or the concept rather of hell, is closely connected also to the concept of sin, obviously. And that's easy enough for most Christians today to understand. But what exactly is that relationship? Well, it seems that a lot of Christians today have this conception that it's a one and done. I just make some little mistake and oopsie doopsie, whenever I die, I guess I'll just be thrown into some subterranean chamber where I'll be burned in darkness forever and punished like that. But the idea of hell that Jesus proposes to us seems very, very different from that. For example, you look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is the longest collaboration of all of Jesus' teachings, or it's the most in-depth study of what Jesus' teaching to a town or village would have looked like. And so you go to a place like Matthew chapter 5. And Jesus is going through all the different commandments, and he says, for example, in verse 21, he says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering." He says, "Come to good terms with your accuser quickly while you are with him on the way to court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will not be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last quadrans." Then he continues on and he says this, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, if your right eye is causing you to sin, tear it out and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand is causing you to sin, cut it off and throw it away from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell." Now, what Jesus is saying here is pretty extreme. You read, he says, it's better for you to tear out your eye than for it to lead you into hell. So is Jesus saying we should all tear out our eyes? Because, as far as I'm concerned, all of our eyes have slipped up and we've all done the dirty. So what does that mean for us? If our eyes have caused such great evil, does that mean that we should literally tear them out? And if not, then what is Jesus trying to say here? Well, it seems that even those who would claim to take the most literal interpretations of a biblical hell wouldn't tell anybody to literally pluck out their eyes. So what is Jesus saying that we should do here? Well, he says to tear it out because it's better to have it torn out than for the whole body be taken into hell. So apparently that eye is going to do something that's going to affect the entire body and take it into hell. Well, then you go back earlier and you read how he said, you shall not commit adultery, or you shall not commit murder. He quotes some of the 10 Commandments. And then he says to them that whenever you look at a woman with lust, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. Or that whenever you're angry with your brother, you've pretty much already, I guess, in an interpretive way, committed murder in your heart. And so first we have to ask, what does it mean to commit murder of the heart, or to commit adultery of the heart? What does it mean to commit sin in the heart? Jesus, what do you mean here? Could you be any less clear? Well, it seems that by reading this next part, that Jesus is talking about our sins taking over who we are, consuming us, and affecting our hearts to the point where it consumes us and it takes us down this road of death and destruction. In other words, it starts with lust. We look at a woman with lust, and then next thing we know, we go down in that rabbit hole, and next it may be fantasies or masturbation, and then porn, and then adultery, and then scandals and all that stuff. Or for anger, it gets from anger to gossip and rumors, to saying terrible things to people's face, to punching them in the face, to getting into fights, to actual murder. And, we all say that we would never go there, but then we've all done stuff that we're not proud of and that nobody knows about. And we've already all been at places that we told ourselves that we'd never be at. And so Jesus says, it's better for you to tear out your eye, your good eye, than to have it drag you into the fires of hell. So what Jesus is saying here is that, remember, he talks about the heart, how it's a sin of the heart. In Hebrew, which is definitely a language that Jesus understood and thought in Hebrew, the heart is not just a place where you feel things. The heart is where you think. It's where you think, where you feel. It's your internal processor. And so apparently whenever we sin, whenever we say something wrong, see something wrong, do something wrong, it's not just a sin of the hands or the eyes or the mouth. It's a sin that corrupts our heart. Because the heart is wicked and evil above all things. And so it corrupts our heart, and it makes our heart more evil. And out of our heart, to put this in a contemporary understanding, out of our heart comes veins and arteries, and those pump out all the blood, and our blood circulates through all our body and sends nerves everywhere so that we can do everything that we do. And so if it's in the heart, that's sending it out to everywhere. And it becomes a part of the entirety of who we are. And so what Jesus is saying here is it's not just a sin of the eyes or the ears or the hands. It's something that's taking us captive and making us, as he says in another part of the Bible, in John, the Gospel of John, he says, we become slaves to sin. And it's like sin rules us and we become sin. We become the sin that we are doing. And a lot of us would say, oh, you're not defined by what you do. But as the contemporary saying goes, watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your habits. And that's exactly the philosophy that Jesus is getting at here. And he's saying that that's true even of sin. And so sin is at least enjoyable and pleasurable. So when pitted against the good things, it's the sin that we become a part of. We become the sin that we do, and that starts to take over who we are. And James, in James's letter, where he talks, James has his letter, which is pretty much a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And James, Jesus' close brother, has some pretty serious stuff to say about hell. He says this. He says, James chapter 3, verse 5, he says, so also the tongue, he's talking about the tongue and how destructive it is. He says the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our body's parts as that which defiles the whole human body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. And so apparently, not only is it true that when we sin with one part of our body, it affects our inside and then our whole body and leads us on this path of our own self-destruction. But apparently it's also true that action in the first place was ignited and initiated out of something hellish. Sin is literally bringing about hell on earth in the opposite way that Jesus was bringing about heaven on earth. And so it's actually just because of this that Jesus needs to come, and he needs to save us, and he needs to bring about heaven on earth instead of hell. And that's why the Gospel of John opens up with saying, for all who believed him, they were given the right to be called children of God. They were defined by their relationship with God rather than what they did and the evil that consumed them. And so you look at all of this in light of the gospel and how we share the gospel. And you look at this in light of how we see God and the justice of God. No longer is it this father who's going and spanking the crap out of his kid just because he accidentally tripped and knocked a vase down and broke it. But it's this father who's saying, don't go play in the mud. And the kids go play in the mud, and the father says, well, look, you're dirty. Now you can't come into the house. You have to stay outside because you can't make my house dirty. Hell is a punishment. It is condemnation, but it's condemnation to itself. It's actually a higher view of hell and of sin to say that Jesus is punishing us to our own sin if we choose to actively reject him, even after he has so many times given us his grace. He punishes us then to our sins by leaving us alone to deal with our own selfish consequences. And so to the many atheists and agnostics that say, look, God is a terrible person because how could he be so judgmental and send somebody to an eternity of death and destruction for just little things that they did? Well, not only do they build up, but not only is it what they do, but they are becoming what they do. And Jesus is leaving them to that. It seems that the atheist would also want the free will to do as they please. And so to them, God says, sure, go right ahead. And he gives them the freedom to do and even become what they want. He gives them the freedom to live their lives without him. It's this place outside of the cosmos that's entirely impossible to explain or to comprehend. This is not a light view of hell just because it's without a literal fire or pitch blackness, but it's actually much worse because it means that the actions that we do now have eternal consequences, and they've already begun. You think of this idea of being thrown outside of the Jerusalem in the new creation, where we have to deal with our own problems, our own struggles. And this totally and completely changes how we see absolutely everything. Now we're the unjust ones who want to live our own lives free from God transforming us and making us more like him, because we don't want to have to obey him and who he is and what he tells us to do. And actually, speaking about this now, it brings to mind one last incremental Bible verse or verses to the concept of hell found in the Gospel account of Luke. Luke chapter 16, starting in verse 19, Jesus tells this parable. I'll give this overview. He gives this parable and he says, there's a rich man, or I guess I'll just read it. He says, now there's this rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and in fine linen, enjoying himself in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed with the scraps which fell from the rich man's table. Not only that, the dogs were also coming and licking his sores. Now it happened that the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's arms. And the rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades he raised his eyes, being in torment, and saw Abraham far away and Lazarus in his arms. And he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, so that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool off my tongue, for I am in agony in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus bad things. But now he is being comfortable here, and you are in agony. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been set, so that those who want to go over from here to you will not be able, nor will any people cross over from there to us. And he said, Then I request of you, Father, that you send him to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, in order that he may warn them, so that they will not come to this place of torment as well. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. But he said, No, Father Abraham, But if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to them, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. There are many interesting things that this brings up, especially in context when considering that Jesus talks about hell being a place of weeping and of gnashing of teeth. You think of weeping and people crying and thinking that they would have made it into living a life with Jesus and restored creation, but not having given themselves up and not having truly allowed Jesus to transform themselves, but deciding to live an arrogant lifestyle instead. And you think of gnashing of teeth, of people who are angry at God and think he's unfair and unjust. And then you read this story, where it begins with the poor man only wanting to receive from Lazarus, the poor man, wanting to receive from the rich man just what the rich man is going to go to want to receive so much more from Lazarus later on. And you'll notice that later, this rich man is still going to continue to try to command him what to do, to go and tell his friends and family so that they can be saved, as if he actually cares for other people. But you'll understand he also never apologizes. He never says, I was wrong. He never asks for forgiveness or admits to his wrongdoing. Because the sin completely overtakes us and becomes who we are. Not only do we have to watch our habits, not only do we have to watch our actions because they become our habits, but we have to watch our habits because they become who we are. And in hell, well, it seems to me that there aren't any real people in hell, because by the time they've made it to hell, they are the sin that took them to hell in the first place. As C.S. Lewis infamously says in The Great Divorce, there are two people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. And so this shouldn't be something that people hold over people's heads when sharing the gospel, or, as Ray Comfort puts underneath their feet. But this should rather be something that wakes us up to the reality of what Jesus has already saved us from. Hell is entirely important, and it speaks to the justice of God and who he is, but only when it's understood correctly within a biblical paradigm. I've heard this saying that Jesus talks more about hell than about heaven, but when you do the math and when you look at the numbers, which I don't have the specifics of right now, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, these are talked about 1,000,000 times more than hell. And this is quite easy to understand when you read something even like the book of Matthew, where, like I said before, the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is brought up so many more times than the word hell is even used. And that says a lot about how we should share the gospel. Not just about what we should mention. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't mention hell. I mean, hell is a terrible reality that does end up as the consequence for those who will reject Christ. However, to put it at the forefront and to make it the center of what the gospel message is about is scandalous and goes against the message and the storyline of the Bible. Hell is here and now. Hell is our horrible habits here and now and coming. So, in other words, what the heck does this mean for us? How can we apply this to our lives and reconsider what hell is all throughout the week and throughout our lives? That's something for us all to figure out. With these last thoughts given beforehand, I hope those are something that'll help you kind of refigure out your place in the world and how you consider the gospel, the Bible, and what it has to say about hell. But with all that being said and done, I hope that this podcast was helpful for you and how you understand hell, and being the last episode in this series on the uncomfortable gospel, I hope that you get a better picture about what the gospel is, with some of its most important terms put within a biblical paradigm. If you did find this helpful, I would find it helpful if you wouldn't mind giving me a great rating on whatever podcast service you're watching to, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And as always, I'll see you soon in Babylonia.